High Commander Verthak's talons clicked against the crystalline display panel of the Dominion flagship Dreadspire, each tap echoing through the hushed command bridge. The massive view screen before him displayed a tactical projection that would have made any other commander purr with satisfaction. 15 warships of the Razorfang Dominion's Third Strike Fleet arranged in perfect attack formation, their weapons primed and shields humming with barely contained power. But Verthak wasn't purring. His primary heart thudded with an unfamiliar rhythm as he studied the anomaly at the center of his fleet's formation. A single vessel of unknown configuration hung motionless against the backdrop of distant stars, its hull a deep, matte black that seemed to drink in the light around it. No visible weapon ports marred its seamless surface. No engine exhaust flickered at its stern. It simply existed, defying every principle of shipbuilding that Verthak had encountered in his 3 centuries of military service. High Commander. Sub-Commander Ixel's voice carried a tremor that made Verthak's facial scales bristle. The vessel continues to absorb our scanning beams. We cannot penetrate its outer hull. Verthak's secondary heart joined the first in its irregular rhythm. In his long career, he had overseen the conquest of dozens of worlds across 3 spiral arms of the galaxy. The Razorfang Dominion had crushed every species they'd encountered, adding their technological and biological distinctiveness to the Empire's ever-growing power. Each victory had been meticulously recorded in his personal battle logbook, a device he wore proudly on his ceremonial belt. But nothing in that logbook matched what he was seeing now. "Increase scanning power," he ordered, his voice carrying the careful precision that had made him famous among his peers. "Focus all auxiliary sensors on the vessel's apparent propulsion system." The bridge crew worked in practiced silence, their scaled fingers dancing across controlled surfaces with practiced efficiency. Around the mysterious ship, invisible beams of electromagnetic energy probed and pushed, seeking any weakness in its peculiar defense. "High Commander." The sensor officer's cry carried notes of both fear and confusion. "The vessel. It's not reflecting our scans at all. The energy is simply vanishing, as if the ship's hull is consuming it." Verthak's third heart, the one reserved for moments of extreme stress, began to beat. "Magnification," he commanded, and the view screen shifted, bringing the alien vessel into sharper focus. Its hull wasn't simply black, he realized. It seemed to shift and flow like liquid shadow, patterns moving across its surface that made his inner eyelids flutter involuntarily. The design was unlike anything produced by the 12 species currently under Dominion control. It spoke of technology that worked on principles they hadn't even begun to grasp. "Weapons analysis," he barked, trying to mask his growing unease with aggression. "No detectable weapon ports, High Commander," the tactical officer reported. "No shield emitters, no missile tubes, no energy projectors." But the young officer's scales had taken on a pale hue. "There are areas of the hull that our systems cannot classify, sections that appear to bend when we try to focus on them." Verthak felt the weight of his crew's attention. They were waiting for his decision, trusting in the experience that had won them 100 victories. His claws traced the familiar patterns of his battle logbook, seeking comfort in its recorded triumphs. "Deploy the fleet in standard conquest formation," he finally ordered, his voice carrying the authority that had broken the will of countless enemies. "Prepare main batteries for demonstration fire. Whatever this vessel represents, it will learn the price of trespassing in Dominion space." As his ships moved into their attack positions, Verthak tried to ignore the growing disquiet in his hearts. The Dominion had never retreated, never shown weakness. Their technological superiority was absolute, their military might unquestionable. Yet as he watched the alien vessel's hull continue its mesmerizing dance, a new thought surfaced in his mind. What if just this once, they had found something that didn't care about their superiority at all? He pushed the thought aside. He was High Commander Verthak of the Razorfang Dominion. His victory was assured. It had to be. In the silence of space, the unknown ship waited, patient as death itself. The message came without warning, cutting through the Dominion's encrypted command frequencies as if they were merely background noise. The voice was calm, measured, and spoke in perfect Dominion standard, each word precisely articulated in a way that made Verithac's scales ripple with unease. "This is Captain Michael Reynolds of the Earth Defense Force vessel Nightmare. You are attempting to engage a human warship. Withdraw immediately." Nervous laughter rippled across the Dreadspire's bridge, quickly silenced by a sharp gesture from Verithac's primary command claw. His crew's amusement couldn't mask the unprecedented nature of the situation. No species had ever decoded their battle communications so easily, let alone responded through them. "Tracking signal source," Sub-Commander Ixel reported, her talons dancing across the crystalline control surface. "It's everywhere. The transmission isn't coming from a single point. Somehow, it's emanating from the entire vessel simultaneously." Verithac's second heart began its warning rhythm as he watched the tactical display. The vessel, the Nightmare, he corrected himself, had begun to move. Its motion defied conventional physics, the hull rippling with patterns that made his targeting systems blur and reset repeatedly. "Unknown vessel," Verithac broadcast, his voice carrying the weight of 3 centuries of Dominion authority. "You have entered sovereign Dominion space. Prepare to be boarded and catalogued. Resistance will result in your immediate destruction." The response was immediate, but not in words. The Nightmare's hull began to shift, the material flowing like liquid metal, but somehow maintaining its structural integrity. Patterns emerged across its surface, geometric shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves impossibly, creating depths where none should exist. "High Commander." The sensor officer's voice cracked with strain. "The vessel's energy signature is changing. We're detecting temporal distortions around its hull. That's not possible in normal space." Verithac watched as his targeting computers struggled to maintain a lock on the human ship. The vessel moved with a grace that mocked their most advanced prediction algorithms, each motion seemingly random yet purposeful. It was like watching a predator swimming through space itself. "Launch warning shots," Verithac ordered, his third heart now joining its siblings in their anxious rhythm. Standard pattern, full spread. Brilliant lances of energy erupted from the Dominion fleet's forward batteries, painting space with artificial lightning. The display should have been enough to cow any rational opponent, a demonstration of power that had brought stronger civilizations to their knees. The Nightmare danced. There was no other word for it. The vessel moved through the barrage as if the deadly energy beams were merely suggestions, its hull bending light and space around itself in ways that made Verithac's inner eyelids close reflexively. Not a single shot connected. "Impossible," Ixel whispered, her scales paling to a sickly shade. The computations required for such maneuvers, the G-forces alone should have crushed any crew to paste. The human vessel's response came again through their command channel, Captain Reynolds' voice carrying an edge of what Verithac would later recognize as pity. "Your targeting systems rely on Newtonian physics and conventional space-time geometry. We abandoned those limitations a century ago. This is your final warning." Verithac felt the weight of his battle logbook heavy against his hip, its recorded victories suddenly seeming hollow. In all his years of service, he had never encountered a species that treated the fundamental laws of the universe as mere guidelines. "Full attack pattern," he ordered, his voice steady despite the growing dread in his hearts. "All ships, concentrate fire. Whatever they're doing, they cannot possibly." The rest of his command died in his throat as the Nightmare began to glow. Not with the familiar energies of weapons or shields, but with something far more terrifying. Cherenkov radiation, the impossible blue light that should only exist when particles exceeded the speed of light in dense matter. They were witnessing the impossible, and Verithac suddenly understood with crystal clarity that his next decision would determine not just his fate, but the fate of the entire Dominion fleet. In the space between moments, as reality itself seemed to hold its breath, Verthek realized that pride might have finally led the Dominion into a battle they couldn't win. The void erupted with light as 15 Dominion warships opened fire simultaneously. Energy beams powerful enough to crack moons lanced through space, converging on the point where the Nightmare hung motionless. Verthek's heart thundered in his chest as he watched the barrage approach its target. No vessel, no matter how advanced, could survive such concentrated firepower. Then reality fractured. The space around the human vessel began to twist, as if someone had grabbed the fabric of the universe and wrung it like a wet cloth. The devastating energy beams bent, scattered, and in some cases simply vanished. Where they should have encountered shields or armor, they instead found nothing but impossibility. High Commander, Science Officer Zexra's voice carried the edge of hysteria. The readings, the human ship is generating Cherenkov radiation in vacuum. That's not. It can't. Her console exploded in a shower of crystalline shards, forcing her to leap backward with a shriek. Verthek's third heart nearly seized as he watched the tactical display. The Nightmare's hull now rippled with streams of ethereal blue light, the characteristic glow of particles exceeding light speed, something that should have been impossible outside of a dense medium. The laws of physics themselves seemed to be unraveling around the vessel. Full power to shields, Verthek commanded, his scales flattening against his skull in instinctive response to danger. Reconfigure all weapons tow. The rest of his order died in his throat as he watched the impossible unfold. The human ship wasn't merely avoiding their attacks, it was moving through space in ways that violated every principle of motion he'd ever known. Where Dominion ships relied on thrust and vector, the Nightmare slid between dimensions, leaving ripples in spacetime like a stone skipped across water. Multiple shield failures reported across the fleet. Ixal's voice cracked with strain. The radiation, it's passing through our defenses as if they don't exist. On the main viewer, Verthek watched in horror as the Cherenkov radiation intensified, casting an otherworldly blue glow across his fleet. The light shouldn't have been visible in space, couldn't be visible in space, yet it painted his ships in ghostly luminescence, like ancient sea creatures caught in a predator's bioluminescent trap. Receiving damage reports from the Shadowclaw and Vengeance, the communications officer reported, his scales nearly white with fear. Their quantum field generators are experiencing some kind of recursive failure. The systems are still there, but they've forgotten how to function. Verthek's claws dug into his command chair as he processed this new impossibility. The humans weren't destroying their technology. They were somehow making it forget its own purpose. His finest ships, pride of the Dominion fleet, were being reduced to confused masses of metal and crystal by weapons that shouldn't exist. Query the archives. He barked, desperation creeping into his voice. There must be some record, some precedent. The Nightmare's next maneuver cut him off. The vessel executed a turn that ignored inertia entirely, pivoting in place as space itself seemed to hiccup around it. The blue glow intensified, and Verthek's inner eyelids slammed shut against the impossible light. When they reopened, the human ship had somehow moved without moving, now positioned directly between his fleet's most powerful vessels. High Commander, Captain Reynolds' voice came through once more, still eerily calm. You're witnessing something your physics says is impossible. Consider what that means about everything else you believe to be true about warfare. As if to punctuate the human's words, a wave of that ghostly blue radiation washed over the nearest Dominion cruiser. Verthek watched in mute horror as the ship's systems simply stopped. Not destroyed, not damaged, but rendered technologically inert, as if the very principles that governed its operation had been locally repealed. In that moment, Verthek understood with crystalline clarity that the Dominion wasn't merely facing a superior force. They were facing a species that had transcended the very rules of reality their civilization was built upon. His fleet, for all its power, might as well have been fighting with stone spears against a force that could rewrite the laws of nature itself. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a treasonous thought took root. Perhaps, just this once, Retreat might be the better part of valor. Verthak had witnessed space combat his entire military career, but nothing had prepared him for this. The Nightmare moved like a predator through shoals of prey, each motion precise and deliberately visible. The human vessel wasn't trying to hide its capabilities anymore. It was showcasing them. Shadowclaw has gone dark, Ixel reported, her voice trembling. All systems disabled. Life support remains functional, but everything else. She paused, checking readings that shouldn't have been possible. It's as if their technology has forgotten how to be technology. The Nightmare carved an impossible path through space, leaving ripples in reality that Verthak's sensors couldn't properly process. Each pass brought another Dominion vessel to silence, not through destruction, but through precise technological neutering. The human ship moved with liquid grace, ignoring the fundamental laws of physics that had governed space combat for millennia. Defensive pattern echo, Verthak commanded, his primary heart racing. All ships, maintain distance and. His orders came too late. The Nightmare phased through space itself, appearing inside their formation, as if the vast distances between ships were merely suggestions. Its hull now pulsed with patterns that hurt to look at, geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. The Vengeance reports complete weapons failure, the tactical officer announced, his scales pale with fear. The Dawnbreaker's shield generators have. Their chief engineer says they've been convinced to stop working. High Commander, I don't understand what's happening. Verthak watched as another wave of that impossible blue radiation washed over the battlecruiser Stormclaw. The massive vessel's weapons powered down one by one, not destroyed but simply retired, as if they had decided warfare no longer interested them. The ship itself remained intact, its crew unharmed but helpless. Analysis of their attack pattern, he demanded, desperately seeking any logical thread to cling to. There must be some predictable element to their movements. The science officer's laugh held an edge of hysteria. High Commander, they're not using attack patterns. They're rewriting local space-time. Our combat prediction algorithms might as well be trying to calculate the dreams of stars. The Nightmare's next maneuver demonstrated the truth of those words. The vessel seemed to fold through dimensions that shouldn't exist, its hull briefly reflecting light from angles that made Verthak's inner eyelids close in self-defense. When it reappeared, 3 more Dominion ships fell silent, their mighty engines reduced to inactive metal. High Commander, Captain Reynolds' voice cut through their command channel again. Your fleet's technology is impressive, but you're fighting with tools that obey the universe's rules. We learned to negotiate with them instead. As if to demonstrate this point, the human vessel executed a maneuver that looked less like spacecraft operation and more like reality itself hiccuping. The Nightmare passed through the flagship's outer defense screen as if the energy barrier was merely decorative, its hull briefly phasing into dimensions beyond Verthak's ability to perceive. Reading massive energy fluctuations, the sensor officer shouted. They're not matching any known weapons signature. It's as if they're suggesting to our systems that they might prefer not to function. Verthak watched in mute horror as his fleet, the pride of the Dominion's third strike force, was systematically reduced to floating hulks. Not through violence or destruction, but through what could only be described as technological persuasion. The human ship moved with deliberate grace, each action calculated not just to disable, but to demonstrate the utter futility of resistance. Dreadspire's primary weapons are no longer responding, Ixel reported, her voice barely a whisper. Secondary systems are. High Commander, they're not damaged. They're just declining to engage. I've never seen anything like this. As the last of his combat-capable ships fell silent, Verthak finally understood what true technological superiority looked like. The Dominion had spent centuries perfecting the art of destroying their enemies. The humans, it seemed, had mastered something far more terrifying: the ability to make destruction itself unnecessary. In the eerie quiet of his partially disabled bridge, Verthak realized that the Nightmare hadn't just defeated his fleet. It had completely redefined what defeat meant. The silence on the Dreadspire's bridge felt heavier than a neutron star's gravity. Verthak watched his tactical display, now showing 12 of his 15 ships floating powerless in space, their systems dormant but crews unharmed. The Nightmare hung in the void between them, its hull still rippling with those reality-bending patterns. Captain Reynolds' next transmission arrived with devastating timing. "Your weapons are impressive, High Commander, but let me show you what you're actually facing." The tactical display erupted with new data, streaming directly into their systems through channels that should have been impossible to access. Verthak's 3 hearts nearly stopped as he processed what he was seeing. "High Commander," Zexra whispered, her claws trembling as she analyzed the incoming data. "These weapons specifications, they can't be real. A single antimatter cascade generator could tear a hole in reality itself, and they claim to have 3 aboard." Verthak's scales rippled with cold fear as he read through the specifications, quantum disruption fields that could unravel matter at its most fundamental level. Gravitational lenses capable of focusing the power of a nearby star into a precision weapon. Something called a relativistic kill vehicle that could accelerate a small mass to such speeds that it could punch through a planet's core. "There's more," Ixel reported, her voice cracking. "Secondary weapon systems include temporal displacement fields, consciousness disruptors, and, by the first egg, something called a probability cannon that can retroactively ensure its target never existed in the first place." The bridge crew's fear was palpable now, filling the air with the sharp scent of stressed scales. These weren't just weapons, they were violations of reality itself, each one capable of ending their civilization with casual ease. "Your civilizations all followed the same path," Reynolds continued, his voice carrying what sounded almost like sympathy. "You discovered spaceflight, developed energy weapons, mastered faster than light travel. But you all stayed within the rules. Humans." A pause. "We decided the rules were more like guidelines." New data flowed across their screens, theoretical physics that made Verthak's head spin, equations that suggested reality itself was negotiable, that the fundamental constants of the universe were more like suggestions than laws. "The radiation weapons you're seeing now," Reynolds continued, "they're not damaging your systems. They're convincing local spacetime that your technology would prefer not to function. We find it more efficient than simple destruction." Verthak's 3rd heart began beating so hard he feared it might rupture. "How?" he demanded, his voice barely a whisper. "How did your species achieve this level of technological advancement?" The human captain's response carried a hint of dark humor. "We spent most of our history trying to kill each other. When we finally reached the stars, we brought along every nightmare we'd ever imagined. Then we made them real." More specifications scrolled across the screen. Weapons that could turn a star's core against itself. Devices that could persuade matter to simply stop being matter. Fields that could convince space that it might prefer to be time instead. "The Nightmare carries enough firepower to reduce your entire fleet to its component atoms," Reynolds explained casually. "We're choosing not to. Understanding that difference is crucial to your species' survival." Verthak's claws dug into his command chair as the full implications hit him. The humans hadn't just mastered advanced technology. They'd transcended the very concept of technological limitations. And this ship, this terrifying vessel that had systematically disabled his fleet, was deliberately showing restraint. "Final systems analysis coming in," Ixel reported, her voice barely audible. "The human vessel's power core. It's not just generating energy. It's locally redefining the laws of physics to make their technology possible. They're not breaking the rules, High Commander. They're rewriting them." As Verthak stared at the cascade of weapon specifications and theoretical physics that challenged everything he thought he knew about reality, one thought crystallized in his mind. The Dominion hadn't just encountered a superior military force. They had stumbled upon a species that had turned their darkest dreams into reality, then chose to use that power with restraint. And somehow, that made them even more terrifying. Verthak's claws flew across his command console, bypassing security protocols he hadn't used in decades. The Dominion's forbidden archives were meant to be sealed, accessible only in moments of civilization-threatening crisis. As he watched the nightmare hovering amid his disabled fleet, he decided disqualified. Access granted to sealed record chamber, the computer announced, its crystalline display flickering with ancient data streams. Warning: information contained within may be hazardous to psychological stability. Display all records containing references to humans or Earth, Verthak commanded, his scales itching with desperate urgency. Priority sort by military significance. The computer hummed, processing his request. Moments stretched like years as his bridge crew watched in tense silence, the blue glow of the Nightmare's hull casting ethereal shadows across their scaled faces. Single record found, the computer announced. Source: Zixel Empire Archives, acquired during absorption of their civilization, dated 3 standard centuries prior to their fall. Verthak's hearts skipped simultaneously. The Zixel had been the most advanced species the Dominion had ever conquered, their technology still beyond full comprehension. If they had encountered humans. Display record, he ordered, his voice barely a whisper. The main screen filled with ancient Zixel script, their flowing characters automatically translating into modern Dominion standard. The message was brief, but its implications sent chills down Verthak's spine. To those who follow, beware the younglings who mastered fire last. While our species spent millennia perfecting plasma weapons, they spent centuries perfecting nuclear fission. While we learned to bend space, they learned to break it. We forge our weapons from science. They forged theirs from nightmares. Additional data recovered, the computer announced, playing attached visual record. The screen shifted, showing grainy footage from what appeared to be a Zixel battle cruiser sensors. Verthak watched in horror as a vessel similar to the Nightmare appeared from what looked like a fold in space itself. The Zixel fleet, over 30 ships strong, opened fire immediately. The human ship didn't evade. Instead, reality seemed to bend around it, weapons fire distorting and vanishing into what looked like microscopic black holes that winked out of existence moments later. Then the vessel released what the Zixel sensors labeled as probability waves. Verthak's third heart nearly seized as he watched. Ships in the Zixel fleet began to simply unexist, not destroyed, not damaged, but retroactively removed from possibility. The footage ended abruptly with a notation. Final transmission from 5th Explorer Fleet. No survivors returned. Accessing additional records, the computer continued, cross-referencing with conquered species databases. More fragments appeared, each one adding to Verthak's growing dread. A Moravian deep space probe's last transmission. They don't obey the laws of physics. They negotiate with them. A Krell Scientific Outpost's final report. Their technology isn't advanced. It's ascendant. High Commander. Zexra's voice shook as she analyzed the data. These records, they're all from the edges of known space. Species we conquered. They weren't expanding outward. They were retreating inward, away from something. She paused, her scales pale. Away from human space. The implications hit Verthak like a gravitational wave. The Dominion's expansion had been too easy, too unchallenged. They hadn't been conquering the galaxy. They had been collecting species that had already been driven into their territory by something far more terrifying. Final record fragment recovered, the computer announced. Source unknown. Age, approximately 1,000 standard years. The screen displayed a single line of text in a language so ancient the computer struggled to translate it. They are coming. The ones who dreamed of crossing stars while still wielding stone axes. The ones who imagined breaking reality before they learned to fly. Pray they choose mercy when they arrive. Verthak stared at the Nightmare, its hull still rippling with impossible energies, and understood with crystal clarity. The Dominion hadn't discovered humans. Humans had allowed themselves to be discovered. choosing this moment to reveal themselves. And somehow, that revelation was more terrifying than anything in the archives. Verthak stood in the Dreadspire's teleportation chamber, his 3 hearts beating an erratic rhythm against his chest plates. Captain Reynolds' invitation to board the Nightmare had been unexpected. The concept of diplomatic talks after such a decisive display of power was foreign to Dominion warfare doctrine. "High Commander," Ixel pleaded, her scales showing distress patterns, "allowing yourself to be transported by their technology. We don't even understand how their systems operate. They could scatter your atoms across space-time." "They've demonstrated they could do that already," Verthak replied, straightening his command sash. "Yet they choose not to. That alone deserves investigation." The transport wasn't like anything Verthak had experienced. Reality seemed to softly blur rather than dematerialize, as if he had simply stepped through a door between moments. He found himself in a corridor that challenged everything he understood about spacecraft design. The walls seemed to breathe, subtle patterns flowing beneath surfaces that looked both metallic and organic. The lighting had no visible source, instead appearing to emanate from the structure itself. Most disturbing were the doorways, perfectly circular portals marked with symbols that his universal translator refused to process, each one radiating a sense of contained possibility. "Welcome aboard the Nightmare, High Commander Verthak." Captain Reynolds stepped forward, extending a hand in what Verthak's diplomatic briefings identified as a human greeting gesture. The captain's uniform was deceptively simple, black with silver trim that seemed to catch light from dimensions that shouldn't exist. "Your vessel," Verthak managed, his military training warring with his instinctive fear. "It defies conventional design principles." Reynolds smiled, the expression somehow both genuine and unsettling. "Conventional design assumes the laws of physics are immutable. We found that reality is more flexible when you know how to ask nicely." They walked through corridors that seemed to rearrange themselves behind them. Verthak's trained eye caught glimpses through those strange doorways. Rooms that contained what looked like miniature stars, chambers where gravity flowed like water, spaces where geometry itself appeared to be more suggestion than law. "Your weapons systems," Verthak ventured, professional curiosity momentarily overriding caution. "They're unlike anything in our records." "Most of what you saw weren't weapons in the conventional sense," Reynolds explained, leading them into what appeared to be a command center. "We found it more efficient to convince local spacetime to temporarily suspend certain physical laws rather than brute force our way through them." The Bridge of the Nightmare was both smaller and more terrifying than Verthak had imagined. Instead of the banks of control stations he expected, there was simply a circular room with walls that displayed what looked like the raw code of reality itself. Symbols and equations flowed like water, occasionally forming into patterns that hurt to look at. "Your civilization values strength," Reynolds continued, gesturing to a floating display that showed the disabled Dominion fleet. "We value efficiency. Why destroy when you can simply persuade?" Verthak watched as one of his mighty warships floated powerless in space. "The radiation you used." "Quantum convincers," Reynolds corrected. "They don't damage technology. They just suggest to it that operational status is optional. Once we leave, your ships will remember how to function properly." The implications made Verthak's scales ripple. The humans hadn't just disabled his fleet. They had temporarily convinced the fundamental laws of reality to take a break. The level of technological advancement required for such capability was beyond comprehension. "Through there," Reynolds gestured to another of those impossible doorways, "is our primary engineering section. Would you like to see what actually powers this ship?" Verthak's military training screamed at him to say no, but his third heart, the one responsible for handling moments of extreme stress, had already accepted that conventional wisdom no longer applied. He stepped through the portal and felt his understanding of reality crack just a little bit more. Because what he saw in that chamber wasn't technology as he understood it. It was something else entirely, something that suggested that humanity hadn't just mastered science. They had transcended it completely. Verthak's claws trembled slightly as he pressed them against the quantum slate, signing the first peace treaty in Dominion history. The document was deceptively simple: mutual recognition of territories, establishment of diplomatic channels, and agreement to cease hostile actions. What remained unwritten was far more significant: the understanding that humanity could have demanded far more, but chose not to. "Would you like some coffee, High Commander?" Captain Reynolds asked, gesturing to a steaming cup of black liquid. "It's something of a tradition during diplomatic meetings." Verthak accepted the cup, his military training warring with his survival instincts. The dark beverage smelled intensely aromatic, and his chemical sensors detected no toxins. As he sipped the bitter liquid, Reynolds smiled in a way that made Verthak's scales ripple. "You know," the human captain said casually, "the Nightmare isn't actually a warship. Not by our standards, anyway." Verthak's primary heart skipped a beat. Not a warship, but the weapons, the reality-altering technology. "This is a diplomatic escort vessel," Reynolds explained, taking the sip from his own cup. "We designed her to be deliberately visible, to operate in ways that other species can perceive and understand. Relatively speaking, she's meant to serve as a warning, a demonstration of what happens when you push humans too far." The coffee cup trembled in Verthak's claws. "A diplomatic vessel," he repeated, his third heart racing as the implication sank in. "Then your actual warships are the ones you never see coming," Reynolds finished, his smile now carrying an edge of predatory satisfaction. "The Nightmare operates within what we call comprehensible impossibility, technology that breaks physics in ways other species can at least perceive and process. Our actual combat vessels operate on principles that would drive most organic minds insane." Verthak's scales paled as he remembered the ancient subtle warnings, the probability weapons mentioned in the old records. "Primitive prototypes," Reynolds said with a dismissive wave. "We've moved far beyond simply editing probability. Our current combat doctrine involves concepts that your language doesn't have words for. The Nightmare can convince local spacetime to temporarily ignore certain physical laws. Our warships can convince reality itself to retroactively rewrite those laws entirely." The human captain stood, walking to one of those impossible doorways that seemed to lead into dimensions that shouldn't exist. "Come here, High Commander. I want to show you something." Verthak approached cautiously. Through the portal, he saw what appeared to be normal space, until he noticed that the stars were moving wrong. No, not moving. Being rearranged, as if invisible hands were reorganizing the very structure of the galaxy. "That," Reynolds said quietly, "is what an actual human combat fleet looks like when they're running stealth protocols. Your sensors wouldn't detect them because they're operating in layers of reality your technology doesn't know exist." Verthak stared into the void, his heart's pounding as he realized he was watching physics itself being rewritten. "Why? Why show me this?" "Because you're going to return to the Dominion with a mission," Reynolds replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "You're going to convince your people that expansion is no longer in their best interest, that there are spaces between the stars where they really don't want to look too closely. And if I fail?" Reynolds' smile returned, gentle but implacable. "Then you'll get to meet our actual warships. The ones that don't bother making their impossible technology comprehensible first. The ones that operate on principles that would make the Nightmare look like a children's toy." Verthak left the Nightmare with his mind reeling and his mission clear. As his fleet's systems gradually remembered how to function, he began composing his report to the Dominion Council. But how could he explain that their mighty empire had spent centuries expanding into what amounted to humanity's front yard? How could he make them understand that their conquest of the galaxy hadn't been a testament to their strength, but rather evidence of humanity's mercy? As the Nightmare folded away into dimensions unknown, Verthak realized that his real task wasn't convincing the Dominion to make peace with humanity. It was convincing them to never, ever give humans a reason to show them what real nightmares looked like.